Hi there. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Bethany Teachman, and I am a professor of clinical psychology at University of Virginia and the co-director of TIDE, which is Thriving Youth in a Digital Environment, and really excited for our conversation today. So TIDE is partnering with the Society of Behavioral Medicine for this Digital Health Industry Summer Speaker Series. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Nicole Currivan and Dr. Robin Anthony-Kouyate, who are here with us to have what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation about different intersections between academia and industry. This is our second in our series. Encourage you to also come back in August for our final. We want to let you know a little bit about TIDES so that you can connect with us in a range of different ways. So we are an initiative at UVA that is trying to really ask two big questions. One is recognizing that youth are spending a lot of time on screens. Can we better understand the impact of digital technology on youth mental health and development? So when is it having positive effects, harmful effects? When is it just another context for development? And then secondly, how can we harness digital technology in order to get youth help when and where they need it most? Kind of leverage the fact that they're on screens in order to increase access to care. And we do lots of different initiatives as part of TIDE. I encourage you to jump on our website to learn more. But in particular, today we're focused on intersections with industry and academia, and we want to invite you to join us. So we have just launched last week an industry affiliate program where we are inviting folks in industry to develop a more formal association with TIDE so that they can more readily have faculty collaborations, potentially be eligible for our seed grants, and learn together about the work that we're each doing and kind of build those relationships. So the QR code is there, or you can find us at the website, but we hope to continue this conversation. Today, though, we are very excited to welcome our two fantastic speakers. So we are thrilled to be joined here by Dr. Nicole Currivan, who is a psychologist and program leader with 25 years of experience in mental health, spanning everything from inpatient and crisis care to federal research and development. She spent the last decade in industry, turning research into real-world health products, driving strategy, research partnerships, and commercialization for digital health products at UPMC Health Plan, where she managed Beating the Blues US, which I think many people are familiar with, which is really the first digital CBT program in the United States. And most recently, she advised ARPA-H on national mental health strategy and program design, driving funding opportunities for accelerating the development of health technology. And her doctoral research produced a novel technology acceptance framework for how people adopt and engage with digital mental health tools. So excited to hear more about all of that. In addition, our moderator and additional panelist, Dr. Robin Anthony-Kouyate, is a public health trained social and behavioral scientist with more than 25 years of experience leading qualitative, mixed methods, and implementation research that really bridges academic inquiry and real-world application. Throughout her career, she has partnered with multidisciplinary teams across industry, academia, healthcare, nonprofit, and community organizations to translate research into scalable products and programs that improve health outcomes. Dr. Kouyaté has held behavioral science leadership roles at Google, Walgreens Health, Amgen, and WellDoc, and as principal owner of RAK Design Consulting. She advises industry, startups, digital health companies, nonprofits, and community-based organizations on research strategy, behavioral science, and evaluation. And she is currently the chair of the Industry Connections Committee for the Society for Behavioral Medicine. So I feel like this should really be called an Ask Me Anything because the combined expertise between the two of them is quite amazing. So we are in for a treat with to learn more about their insights and wisdom. We're going to start off with some questions that we have prepared, but there's also Q&A, and we encourage audience member to add their thoughts and questions about things that they want to know. So with that, let me first turn it over to Nicole and Robin to maybe share any conflicts of interest or disclosures that you need to share, and then we can dive in and start chatting a little bit. Nicole, do you want to share any COIs, and then we'll pass it to Robin?
No COIs to report. Thank you. Nice to
Okay,
meet everyone.
No COIs for me to report either.
great. Well, Robin, do you want to kick
Thanks.
us off?
Yeah, so Thank you so much for having us. I'm excited. Nicole and I are both in Society of for Behavioral Medicine, and so we've had some very fun conversations together, and I'm excited to be able to share in this forum. And Nicole, maybe we'll start off with just asking you to describe some of the academic industry work that you've been involved with, and what was particularly valuable about the partnership, and what was challenging.
Thank you, Robin. I've appreciated talking with you so much about this topic as we prepared. And I think upon reflection, what was most useful to me in terms of working in an industry setting is that I came into it with a research and a clinical background. And then I was working in the industry setting as a clinician and sort of worked my way into managing Beating the Blues, which, in terms of the partnerships I managed, I was managing all of the different sorts of clients that we had for that product. So I was managing health plan clients, employer group clients, and research and principal investigator clients and providers. And so part of my role there as a product manager and strategist was to bring together all of those voices in the way we were developing our products. And a lot of that entailed working with academics to ensure that the product was designed rigorously, that it was working in real world settings. And so having constant conversations about sort of what their needs were for formulating, a robust research study. And, that we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but it is tricky to do that in an industry setting in a robust way. Randomized control trials, for example, are difficult. So in managing those relationships, we were constantly talking about the different needs and values that every participant, stakeholder in that conversation had. And so I think that's one of the challenges. Yeah.
Wow. It's so interesting, and we can delve into this more later, but there are a couple of things that you shared that I hope that the group, I would like people to tune into. You are a clinical, you came in with clinical and research background, but you were a product owner or manager and a strategist. And so one of the things that I found very interesting, as I call it, working my way around the health ecosystem, the different places that we position ourselves to have an impact, and thinking about what role we play. It may not say behavioral scientist or researcher, but you and I talked a little bit about this, but we're still bringing a couple of different perspectives to the table. One, our way of scientific thinking, and then two, how we frame things out. And so I know that's, a little bit beyond that question, but I think it's important for people to start to think about the ways that we contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robin, I'm curious how you would describe, like, in what ways your path to sort of be doing academic industry bridging is similar to Nicole's or different from Nicole's.
Yeah, yeah. Probably, we have some overlap, and this is what's always so exciting, right? There's so many different ways we could contribute. So when I said working my way around the health ecosystem, I started out actually in global health before USAID projects closed. But it was really great training for working in these cross-functional teams, which was a term that you hear a lot in industry, right? So it takes, and so you may be, and I was often an individual contributor, bringing my behavioral science training. My public health background means that when you compare to Nicole, who has a clinical background, public health, you're often thinking about populations, you're thinking about programs, right? So I'm bringing that lens into these cross-functional partnerships, which include, similar to what Nicole said, I'd be working with clinicians, user experience design people, engineers, product team people, the business owners, right? And we could talk more about that. And then bringing that behavioral science perspective in to digital health startups as an individual contributor. And that distinction is a new term that I learned, where you're actually doing the work, right? You're bringing in, you're conducting the research, you're designing the research. You can also be a manager, where you're managing a product which is what Nicole described. So I did that for digital health startup WellDoc at the time, which was one of the first what's now called digital therapeutics, helping people to manage chronic conditions. Then within the biotech company, that was interesting as well because the working in the startup was much more like the work we probably do as researchers, designing an intervention, testing if it works. In the
Mhm.
startup, it was a digital health and innovation group. And really, they're just trying to figure out how does technology support the business. So I was still contributing. And then another distinction I'd like to make too is what are the range of types of research that we bring to the table and that we partner with academia on. So in this case, because a lot of the work was in that earlier innovation phase. So before you ever get to the clinical trial, you're needing to do formative research, or as UX people call it, foundational research. And then you're designing a concept that's at least evidence informed and often bringing in the literature, because that's often what people forget to do are our wonderful lit scans or literature reviews, bringing that in, you working with academia to bring in the latest and greatest, because people who are in that academia, they're subject matter experts, this is what they work on. And so bringing that into industry and then developing a concept and testing it. So that type of research. And so academia fits in really well there because they have the broad perspective of what's been going on in recent years. Um, from that role, thinking about what was after that, I've done some work with Google, and also where people who are researchers are embedded, but also we hire researchers as we're thinking about the other end of it too. Along with clinical trials, there's also implementation research. And that's so important because Nicole and I were chatting about this. It's not only what works, but what works and what for whom and what circumstances. So even if you have, efficacy, now you've got to think about effectiveness in different settings. So again, working with academic researchers, a great place to bring in to test out and make sure you have fidelity to the intervention design from the clinical trials, but then how do we test out which populations it works for? How do we tweak it?
No, that's great. And Nicole, I'm curious because one of the things that you touched on, and then I think Robin expanded on, is sort of like academic industry work can look really different depending on those different settings, but also like different stages, a startup versus a really well-established, digital mental health industry company is going to look very different in what it looks like. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit, as someone who has worked in a lot of spaces, of what you see as both the like opportunities and real value of those partnerships across these different setting and stages, and what you see as different challenges that arise.
I'm so glad you asked that, Bethany, because I wanted to build on the distinction that Robin had brought up and, talk about sort of from the 50,000-foot view, right, what the North Star might be across teams, and then how each one of them might be looking differently at that North Star. So, at least from my own perspective, after having worked in various settings, the North Star really is how do we translate robust, scientifically grounded interventions to people in a way that they're actually going to use and engage with and get the outcomes from. I think everyone's sort of aligned around that North Star, right? But what complicates that, from a research perspective, right? We're thinking about the academic rigor, the research design, making sure we're designing to understand that signal, whether the outcomes are actually happening. And there are a lot of complicating factors in terms of incentives in that environment, right? We have to get the right funding. We have to work with the right group. We have to live in the right city where our family can thrive, right? All those sorts of things. In a business setting, that North Star is being approached from a return on investment perspective, right? And are we going to have, quality of life increasing for our patients that are our members at our health plan, for example? And then from a government level, depending on how the funding is being offered. So when I was advising at ARPA-H, I was working on their national mental health strategy. And, we were thinking about how do we activate the ecosystem and put money where it needs to go so that we could accelerate the technologies that are needed to solve systemic problems in healthcare. And so that's another angle of looking at how do we incentivize the development of the right sort of things when no one else seems to be incentivizing it and it's very high risk. So in a business setting, Risk is a big concern, and you're working with multidisciplinary teams, some of which are going to be concerned with that bottom line. They're going to be concerned with, does this fit in our business strategy? Does it make sense in terms of, can we be reimbursed for this? Oftentimes in healthcare, it's reimbursement, right? Or can we have a direct consumer model? Is there another business that's going to license our software? How do we get to pay for this massive team, right, that we need to update and work on this technical product? And so that's a real consideration alongside, it gets complicated, right? The clinical efficacy, and also whether or not people even want the product, whether or not they're going to leverage the product and get the result, right? So you really need a village to make that happen. And a lot of times the risk is just, you see, you have a vision, it would help a lot of people, but the risk is just too much. And so that's where certain entities like, private philanthropical organizations and also ARPA-H would step in and say, we're going to put this funding here because the risk is too much, yet we still need to convene the scientists and the business folk, get them talking together about how we resolve this risk and really make a solution that works. It's a very complicated problem and sometimes really needs a lot of incentives to get over that hump.
I love, by the way, that you were talking about the North Star with your particular background for Sue. I was like, this is perfect. That's great. So you referenced needing it taking a village. And that raises for me, trying to understand within that village, how have you both sort of like navigated that need to sort of like articulate the particular value that you bring and how to position yourself within this kind of complex digital health team that's got clinical scientists, engineering, commercial roles, all the different places. How did you, help to carve out what you offer and what you bring to the table, especially with your diverse backgrounds?
Would you like me to answer that first, or Robin, what's your preference?
You're unmuted, go for it.
Okay. So we were talking about this and really had a fun time kind of sussing out what the themes were. I think that one of the things I'm always thinking about, and in part I have to attribute this to a training that I highly recommend. It's the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science training. I took that, you're nodding your head. I took that 10 years ago, and it has been infinitely helpful because they let you sort of figure out what your elevator pitch is for, and the why of what you're doing, the what of what you're doing, and the intended, so how it's helping people is very important to communicate. And also, so not only the values of it, the value proposition for the business, but the why it's important, the what it's going to achieve. Those are the core parts of an elevator speech. And I think, what's always in my mind when I step into a room and try to understand, I take a learning stance about the people in that room and the setting, right? The company or the setting, what they're trying to achieve. I think that's really important, right? You can't assume, what the setting is trying to accomplish until you understand the needs of the people there and the needs of the business. So you have to sort of learn about those things and understand that no matter where you go, if you're working on a multidisciplinary team, everyone will be holding a different part of the elephant. And so, one of the things that I did over the years initially was, sort of as a novice, like I was assuming that people knew what I knew, and they often really just don't. And that's because we all bring different values and expertise, right? So I think part of the message is making sure that, you're checking your assumptions, making sure that you assume that maybe they don't know, you don't know, right? And trying to figure out what knowledge needs to be shared among everybody and gained and learned so that you all have you can align, right, around the values and the direction, the needs, how to meet that. And so I've learned to be a little less fearful about communicating not only my value as a professional to the room, right, what I can contribute, and getting that message really crystal and clear and sort of automatic, right? but also, eliciting that from others, understanding sort of like how they're thinking about it and what they would like to bring to the table.
Can you just expand on that last part, what you meant when you said eliciting that from others? Are you talking about what are you eliciting from others? I just want to make sure I followed that piece.
Sure. Yeah. So I was talking with Robin about this too. Early on in my career, I don't know that it was even my career. During my bachelor's degree, I was a salesperson, right? I was selling clothing, and I was trained in sales at that time. And what they trained me to do was very useful throughout my career also. They said, look, you can't sell something to somebody. And I'm talking about an idea above and beyond a product, right? A concept is important to sell as well. You can't sell it to them until you understand what their needs are and how they're approaching the problem. So, if some, like, you might not know why they're going to say no to this, and you need to know that in advance, and then match what it is that you're bringing or the concept that you're bringing to how it will meet their needs.
That's super helpful. Robin,
Yeah,
anything you'd add?
absolutely. Am I frozen? Are you hearing me
You're
okay?
back now. You were a
Okay, all
robot
right.
for a bit, but you've come back to us.
We talked about this quite a bit, because this is probably one of the things that makes you most successful is figuring out how to navigate the room. And the perspective I'll bring also is in mostly innovation spaces. And so what I mean by that is these are spaces where they say, oh, we're just going to get a bunch of smart people in the room to figure it out, as opposed to we're going to, do a clinical trial and follow procedures that have already been established. Should I take that again? Did you?
Yes, you went a little
Okay.
garbled on us.
Okay. I was saying that I'll talk about it from an innovation perspective, which is where often people say, we'll get a bunch of smart people in the room to solve the problem and figure it out. So think of a little bit of Wild Wild West, which is slightly different. And anybody can find themselves in any of these, types of settings where a clinical trial, you've got a protocol, you know exactly the steps you take, the process and the method, even if you don't know what the outcome is. So uh, in these innovation spaces, which I feel are very important for us to be in, because these are the places where people are framing out how you even think about approaching the problem. And as a researcher and a scientist and academician, you bring a perspective for thinking about that. And so, similar to Nicole, I told her that I would walk into rooms. I mean, when I walk into the room, often I would have the mantra, I have something to contribute and I have something to learn. And I'm not joking. I said that to myself every single time because sometimes it can be a little daunting. People are speaking English and you're thinking, huh, I don't know what this means. But believe me, they also don't know what you mean as well. And so that's building off of what Nicole says. And you have people speaking engineering, design, product, and these are all different languages, by the way. It sounds business
Yep.
and then science, right? So one of the things, and this is probably my favorite part of navigating it, you do need the village. You absolutely need the village. And so my first message is value that. So no, everybody is an expert in different areas. And the other thing Nicole and I talked about and agreed on, curiosity. You've got to have that growth and curiosity mindset to figure out what it is that people know. How do you work with them to solve the problem that the business is trying to solve? So my second message, so let me stop for a minute and make sure, Bethany, because I can see your
You're
face.
going in and out. So I'm going to make a
Okay.
suggestion here because we're
Okay.
losing periodically here. So
Okay.
why don't you leave and come back and then we'll get your second message because I have to say
Okay.
I'm telling my kids the write down I have something to contribute and something to learn at dinner tonight. So we are all this is the new mantra. I love it. But yeah, if you want to sneak out, come back.
Okay.
Cole and I will keep chatting. So.
Okay. All right.
Nicole, I'm curious, yeah, I really appreciate hearing these different perspectives. I wonder if I could ask, slightly more personally, like, which parts of like making that transition were the hardest skills for you to bring on board? Like, it's always that thing where it's like, partly because we have lots of like early career folks who are probably listening in and stuff like that. And sometimes I think it can almost seem intimidating because it's like you've already figured this out and been super successful in your roles and all of those kinds of things, right? And sometimes I think people then think like you must have always been like that. And of course, if you're anything like me, there was a whole lot of learning along the way and missteps and all those things. And I wonder if you can talk about like what was hard about that path and like how you figured that out a little bit.
I sure can. And so before I address that, I just want to add to something that Robin was saying that is super important because that's a global theme, the idea of sort of respecting and valuing the diversity of a team. And that is, I wanted to just say that that applies very usefully to clients as well. So to end users of your product. So essentially, this is how I think about commercialization strategy and that long game of how you get to a successful product. You sort of have to, in the beginning, you have to get the voice of the user in the room and, learn what their needs are and what their wants are, because you can waste $5 million building something they will simply not use. And you don't want to do that. That's one of the missteps, right? And so it's important to understand that the end user is a deep expert in their life experience, and especially in marginalized communities, this is true. We simply cannot assume and understand what what their setting is like until we've asked.
Yeah.
So that's important. And then I think that's probably one of the things, some of the soft skills that go to your other question, right, are embedded in one of the books that I highly recommend to people. It's old, but I go back to it again and again. Is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, because he talks about the yes and a little bit. So he talks about like get people saying yes, yes, right? And the only way to do that is to listen first, understand what they're facing, and then meet them where they are, right? And so that's true not just with end users, but it's true in a corporate environment. And what might be different, everybody's experience is a bit different, but in an academic setting, right, you have a very clear hierarchical structure. And sometimes you can run into egos and people who say this is how it's going to be, and they have the power to do that, right? Academic settings, I've heard a lot of stories about how they can be difficult to navigate because your autonomy is not always clear, in doing things. And in a corporate setting, there's a different version of that. There's a structure. Everybody theoretically has their role, but you can find yourself in a matrixed organization like a UPMC Health Plan. The division I worked in, Work Partners, was a matrixed organization where we had like these cross-functional teams. By the way, another important skill is to be able to define the jargon as you're using it, or just simply not use it at all, right? So when I say cross-functional teams, I mean, that you've got like a team here, and a team here, and all those experts are sort of also embedded in each project you work on. And you can reach for those teams when you need them and say, hey, I might need, 0.5 of your time or something like this. And it's all, tracked. So in those corporate settings, I think it's important, we were talking about this as well, to find a corporate setting where you feel like your values are aligned with what the company or the department is trying to achieve. And so that certainly helps, because that helps to generate that yes, get people to say yes. It's easier to do that when you're aligned. And gosh, I forgot what I was going to say related to that. It'll come back to me, but it's important to be able to understand, sort of be able to read the room in terms of what the culture is. The culture changes from academia to corporate environments, and in startups as well. That's what I had wanted to say. So startups are even more loose. And, you have, like in the role that I'm in now as a chief product officer, I am, driving strategy, but also having a lot of client conversations and just sort of, all hands on deck, right? Where I'm needed, that's where I go. And so it's important to know where the boundaries of your role are, and to be able to talk about that and be able to have a good sense of, from your direct supervisor and the people you're collaborating with, what they're looking for and what's needed. Especially if you're somebody who has a lot of great ideas for innovation, it's good to try and find a space where that's welcomed.
Yeah. Hopefully you can hear me better.
You're
Yeah.
back, which is good. Please
If
jump in.
not, I can also try turning off my camera.
You're good.
But I wanted to come back to that innovation and something Nicole just said, finding the boundaries. We also talked about, and this is a tricky piece too, especially if you're coming in to an organization that hasn't used your research skills. They may have a specific idea. I want you to design a survey with validated questions. But what they may not realize is that you need to be in upstream conversations at that early stage so that you have a clear understanding of why. It's not just designing a questionnaire, or a survey. There's a strategy role for all of us in that room. And so making sure, and comes back to navigating that space, that you're either invited into the room, and so helping people to understand, in order to develop a survey in this example that is useful for you, I need to understand what this. So Nicole mentioned earlier, in industry, which I agree with, it's ROI. So how are they making money? So that's their upstream, and then everything trickles down. So if the money is made through engaging people, meaning people using your product, people using your Apple Watch or your Fitbit, and then you're designing a survey to understand what it makes people want to use the product, you need to understand where are they getting people, how, the whole context of the work. It's not just designing a survey. And I do think that, at least in my experiences working my way around the ecosystem, that's been one of the biggest challenges, to make sure you're in the room and helping people to understand how that'll improve the value and the quality of your work for them achieving their business goal. And not being afraid to insert yourself, because and knowing that you need to understand more in order to bring your full value. And then something else we talked about, which it takes a little time to understand, we bring a range of things to the table. So as an academic researcher, you may have your subject matter expertise, youth and mental health. You also have your skills. You design surveys, you conduct qualitative research, you do implementation science research. You also have a way of thinking and framing things out. And I really do highlight that, because that's something, the way that we're trained is different than, say, people trained in business or engineers. And so when you're thinking about articulating your value, remember to think of all of those things, because that puts you in different rooms. That framing things out puts you in a strategy space. The subject matter expertise helps you define the problem. From Nicole mentioned the user, it's almost like a Venn diagram. There's the user and there's the business. And so you're understanding what they're trying to design as an intervention, and you're understanding also from a user perspective based on your subject matter expertise. And so, and then of course there's the implementation and execution, in which your actual research skills come into play. And so I encourage people not to sell themselves short in terms of what academics bring to the table.
Can I ask a follow-up for both of you tied to that? This is, yeah, really interesting conversation. As you're pointing out, you bring your research skills and you bring your scientific thinking into the room, which is a huge contribution. And at the same time, you're also recognizing that sometimes the timelines, incentive structures, all those kinds of things may be different between academia and industry, and sort of how that, desire for research and fits, doesn't fit, all of those kinds of things. And I wonder if you can talk about where you've had success in making the case for the importance of sort of bringing in more of that scientific process or research, and what has helped you to make that a compelling argument in these spaces where timelines are really different, incentive structures are different, need to show ROI might look a little different, all of those kinds of things. Like, what has helped to be able to really make the research case in those ways? And not that there's friction in all cases, loads of, but there are potential tensions.
Yeah, I would say the friction that you mentioned is almost always their timelines. I mean, I think that one is and maybe I'll start off and then Nicole, one of the things that I think this is important, really important for academics as well, to think about the range of types of research it takes to go from a concept to commercialization of a product. And so, we bring in, and so figuring out what they need at a given moment, I think helps address that, right? So where we might go from literature scan to then designing our protocol to then implementing the research and then sharing the findings. There may be, and I'll say it in the innovation space in particular, there may be, they even call it stage gates, right? So depending on where you come in, there may be different things that you bring to the table. So if you're really early on, maybe it's the literature review or scan, and I say scan because it may not be as rigorous as we would do for, but it doesn't make it less valuable because you're bringing in what's important. And that might change the whole trajectory of what they do because they may not know what's been proven not to work or to work. So that's breaking it down. Then from there, the concept testing, that early formative research to understand your user. Maybe someone's already figured out, okay, this is the intervention, but we need to test it in this population. So bringing that skill in. If you're and working with user experience people as well, because they understand how the users interact with the product. From there, maybe they've already done that. Maybe they need you to design an assessment to make sure they're assessing the right thing. Because sometimes they want to just take a validated tool, but may not be what they designed. So you might be able to help them navigate what tool is relevant or help them design questions that actually assess what was designed and did it work? Did it engage and did it work? Or maybe it's just even assessing the engagement, even forget you haven't gotten to the health outcomes. Then you might do implementation research and some of this you might not go in with. I learned much of this human-centered design research and implementation research got stronger as I was working, but implementation research a little bit more rigorous of assessing, did this work, did it make a difference for the population that they're trying to serve? And then the last might be an initial trial, because you don't want to do the trial if you haven't gotten the intervention correct, because then you're measuring the wrong thing. So I would just say that's one approach to thinking about where you can plug in. So it's not just, oh, did it work, right? So that's the timeline challenge. Is they talk about agile development and design, right? Agile meaning versus waterfall, you design it, throw it over and say, did it work? But agile is testing frequently along the way. And so I think that's one way to become comfortable with that.
That's super helpful. Nicole, what would you add?
Yeah, there's so much to say here. So I'm just going to try and pick out the most important points. And I love everything that Robin said about the process. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the values that have helped me. So one is being passionate about the values and the idea. And what that turns into, practically speaking, right, is being able to look at and use the data that you have that exists that says there is a need here. So in any business setting, they're going to want a business case. And I've always had to, I had the extreme luck of having a supervisor from the very beginning who really valued data-driven business case. And she asked me to continue to write those again and again. And so I got a lot of practice in being able to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a business strategy and the value proposition of meeting a certain need that comes up in the data. In order to do that, right, in a good business case, you need to have a highlight for, executives of the literature review and a clear understanding, a persuasive understanding of why it's important to meet this need. And to Robin's point, you need to be able to get conversant. This is where academic skills are so helpful. You need to be able to get conversant in a particular domain, even if it's adjacent to yours, review the literature, right? Be able to do the due diligence and say, here's where the growing edge is in terms of, cardiac rehab patients, or, right, that these interventions don't exist. Because in a business setting, you're going to be faced with, businesses are always faced with the question of build by partner. Do we build this ourselves at great cost and potential liability? Do we buy this thing because it already exists as a package and it really meets our needs very well? Do we partner with somebody who has the existing tools and repackage it, or and all of those have different financial implications, and they have different justifications, right, on the basis of the science and the data. So being able to be conversant in those justifications and speak to them before you walk in the room is very helpful. Being able to do a quick literature review and just sort of understand, we have better and better tools for this. And that's actually a tool I'm working on right now, that would help us to get conversant as fast as possible in what studies have been done and in the literature base. So, having the passion to do that and the curiosity to do that and be useful to others in that way is one thing. But also developing champions in your teams and in your business and relationships of trust is another way to make that case. So, what I've found is that because I'm passionate about the idea, because I've been reading the literature, I say, "Ooh, I get on fire about this thing because I have the justification in my head," right? And then I go and I talk to other people, behind the scenes in the business and say, like, "What do you think about this?" Right? Do you think there's an appetite for this sort of thing? What do you think about our strategy? So, as Robin was saying, if you're not in that room, you at least need to have trusted relationships of you're supporting people who are in that room and they're communicating back to you sort of what their needs are. And then you can be of value to them because you're coming to them with the rationales and the support and the knowledge that they don't have the time as managers to really develop. I mean, they might have expertise, of course, right? But they're relying on you typically as you come into this to bring the value of the time spent and the lessons learned in these, academic environments and understand what challenges and barriers they might face. A large part of what leadership has valued me for in the past has been my ability to identify risk in terms of, I don't think this is going to work for this population, or to identify where there could be value.
Could I add to something Nicole said that brought, and I'm sure you've heard this, we all hear about mentors, but there's another term, sponsor. And so when Nicole was talking, and I pause for a second. Okay, it reminded me of the importance of sponsors. So people who understand what you bring, and the sponsors are usually people in the organization, in the company, who are higher level. They're in those decision-making rooms. They're in the strategy rooms. They know enough about you that when they hear something that requires your input, they say, "Oh, Robin, Nicole, Bethany can do that." And they bring you into those rooms. That's something that's very, very important. I can't highlight that enough. And I remember at one point, this was when I was in biotech, someone said that they used to describe me as the secret weapon. And I was like, that's interesting because I really wasn't thinking about it that way. I just love doing the work. But what I realized what that meant was that people were talking. And so people, even if they didn't understand exactly what I did, because you might work on many different types of projects, and so you're bringing different skills, they had enough of a sense to bring me in where I actually fit and where I could contribute. So I think I'm just adding on to what Nicole is saying, in terms of talking to people and making sure that people start to get what you do offer. And maybe what I'll add to that is don't be afraid to try something that feels like it's out of your wheelhouse. Because somebody saw something that said, "Oh, I think she's going to bring or he's going to bring something to this problem." And you're going to grow your wheelhouse and you might love it, right? And you might find another part of your career. So that's also been a part of that curiosity. I don't remember if I said that, but in the growth mindset, really, really important.
Yeah, and I think you're both touching on that willingness to fail a little bit as well, of like taking some risks and, all of those pieces. I wonder if, we can rewind just a little bit here. You've talked a lot about ways that you built those relationships, advance your skill set, as you've been in some of these roles. Can you go backwards a little bit? And we had some questions come in from people at earlier career stages who are wanted to know, like, when they're in graduate school, what are things they might be doing to prepare themselves to enter these spaces and to be developing those skills? And I think it's, I wonder if you can comment a little bit that at least some of the things we hear from graduate students across spaces, because we're working with graduate students nationally in different programs, is sometimes they're in settings where there's like a lot of support from their mentor for exploring these opportunities, serving as sponsors, as you would, say, Robin. And in other cases, they're not so much. And so they're trying to do this a little bit more independently without as much scaffolding or help. And I wonder if you can talk about how people can position themselves, to figure out how they can contribute and how they can learn in those different spaces.
Yes, I love that question. I wish I had had some of this knowledge when I was a graduate student, so I'm
Why
excited to
we're
answer.
doing this.
I think, first of all, there is a distinction among academic settings of how your degree is being funded, right? So that changes how much autonomy you have. And for example, being able to, get coverage to go to a conference or get, coverage to decide on a particular dissertation topic, for example. So I was very lucky. I went to a private university, and because of that, and because I was paying for the degree, um, I got really great advice from, this might not always be possible, but if it is, I recommend it, from a professor who said, this is your moment in which you can study something that is going to make a radical difference. And you can say anything you want, because in this particular case, I was at a university where it wasn't R1 and the professors' reputations weren't staked on, right, the particular topic I was doing. And also the focus of the program was social justice. So I was encouraged to really think outside of the box about what I wanted to study and become conversant in that. Even if that's not available to you, one thing that I really recommend is simply reaching out to people in industry and in academic settings who are doing similar work or work that inspires you, and asking if you can talk with them about where they think the pain points are in the field, where you could work on problems that are really going to shift things. Because it does take a few decades to get that sort of 50,000-foot view, right? And understand where the pain points are. And so you can leverage their expertise. You can and should, right? Use them as mentors. And then, okay, I forgot again what I was going to say. Trainings, right? Trainings and conferences are big. So there are certain job roles where, a training is going to get you really far, or a certification. So, and you have to sort of make the assessment, is this worth the money? There are a lot of trainings out there that are very expensive, and they're typically corporate sponsored. That's why they're expensive. It's important to sort of find the trainings that are more low-hanging fruit in terms of cost if you're a graduate student, right? But that give you deep values. They're free trainings for, if there's a free training, for example, for like CBTI or something along those lines. And then you can say, I'm conversant in this, especially clinical skills. It's important to have some way to operationalize your clinical understanding. I did 3 years of Gestalt training, and I paid for that, but it was very useful in terms of, now I'm able to say that I'm trained in this area. I'll say that was less useful in a business setting, but you can think about the trainings and ask about the trainings that would be of value. And then in conference environments, same thing. Talk with people, ask them what their perception is of where you could work, and what their pathway was like.
That's great.
Um, Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And full disclosure, because Nicole and I talked a little bit about this too, we both have very non-traditional pathways. I think both of us worked for many years before we went back to school, but for our doctorate. But what
Right.
I would say, Nicole talked about her sales job. I was in global health. I would say a couple of different things. One, which seems adjacent but is important, bring everything that you have. You worked somewhere, you probably worked in college, all those things, bring them in to what you're doing. Read about talking to people. And I have a couple of one of my favorite examples, LinkedIn. most people are familiar with LinkedIn. Uh, Alumni, you don't have to know the person. One of the people that reached out to me when I was at Amgen had studied, or was in the same. She was in the master's program where I did my doctorate, and she reached out to me once. I probably missed it. She reached out a month later, and she said, "Hey, I've applied here, and you know anything about it?" It happened to be my department. One of the challenges for getting experience is figuring out where and with whom. And
Right.
so I was able to talk to someone, and he said, "Oh, one of the secret weapon people." He's like, "Oh, okay." I did just get her resume, and I said, "I know her, but I don't know her, but I do know her training, and it looks like she really could be an asset." She came in, she was phenomenal. Not she interviewed with me, but other people, and she got the job. So I really would encourage using your alumni network and finding out where. Now that was for a job, but it could also be for an internship. It could
Right.
also be for like helping them research people, less formally, meaning we all want to be paid for our value. But if you are offering your services without being paid, you still can capture that on your resume. And then now you have experience that you can claim, and that person may really need your expertise, and I've definitely worked with different students and early career people in my, where we brought people in and they brought a lot of value. So that's another way that I would really highlight. There's also something called externships, which I don't know if people are familiar with, but just they're short, like week long. Because another interesting thing is figuring out, we say industry is this opaque term, it's as if it's one thing. It's
Right.
extremely diverse. And the cultures, which is most important, what I want to say, are diverse. I worked brief at Walgreens in their healthcare setting that had a retail culture, much more so than say um, Amgen Biotech, which had sort of more of that. There was more research akin. There was research at Walgreens as well, but the retail aspect came through. So being able to do an externship might also help you figure out where you'd like to position yourself. And I think that's one of the things you were talking about, Bethany. So you can talk to people, but being in that environment really makes you say, "Oh, okay, I like this culture a little bit more." Or where you position yourself. I would like to be on a clinical trials team. I'd love to do the formative research for a commercial team. I want to own the product and make the decisions, right? So these are all within industry, but starting to think about the type of industry and then where you position yourself.
No, I appreciate that. Gosh, it's going quickly. We only have a few minutes left. If anybody has a question from the audience, feel free to pop it in. I want to go back. Robin, you said use everything in terms of your background and different roles you've been in, whether it seems obvious or doesn't seem obvious. And I really appreciated that. And I want to link into Nicole, you talked about in your PhD that one of the things you really valued in that is that it had a very strong social justice lens and focus. How are you bringing in that social justice lens in the work that you're doing now? Obviously incredibly important and this is a time where it can be challenging to make sure that that voice is really strong. So I wonder if you can talk about how you've been able to carry on that work in your roles.
I think quickly, one good thing about the behavioral health, domain, right, is that it's easier to find people who are concerned with social justice in this kind of work because inherently you develop an understanding of how critically important that is systemically and individually in your work. Basically, working at ARPA-H, which is, a government-funded agency that goes through political transitions with their appointed, director. It's important to find a sort of like ground truth and way of discussing what's important. So what I adhered to in that setting, despite like changing, perspectives on the sort of the beast of how do we deal with behavioral health systems, was that the mission of ARPA-H was to make sure that the interventions we funded would reach everybody. And that didn't change, right? I mean, I wasn't going to necessarily go into a room using the language of social justice, but I understood that we were all aligned around making sure that these interventions, the value of funding them was that everybody could be able to use them. And so there's still a way to have that discussion without necessarily using words that have become politicized. And similarly, sorry, I'm forgetting which other setting where this was like super. Oh, in the work that I'm doing now, right? As I was looking to pivot to a role back in industry, I really just made sure that the people that I was talking with understood those values too. And it can sometimes feel wonderful to get into a space where those things are aligned and you feel safe to have those conversations, and that that's woven in to the business strategy from the very beginning. Don't let business strategy fool you from thinking that DEI doesn't have value. It has immense value to the bottom line of a business, and how you talk about it doesn't matter as much as the fact that you're aligned on that concept of that everyone's voices need to be included.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe I would just add another languaging thing because we know that's really important. Nicole just referenced what I'll sometimes call universal approaches, right? It's got to reach everyone. But companies are also talking about hyper personalization because of AI and the fact that you can tailor or hyper personalize things. And so sometimes you don't need to say everything up front, but if you know that's their goal, now you're responsible for the strategy of thinking about what does that mean, because it's not only on demographics. There's so many different ways that we can think about it. So they will enliven you think about that segmentation strategy. And that's where you could bring in, social justice and understanding social determinants of health, and then how to address it.
No, I appreciate that. We only have about a minute left, so I want to give you each a chance if there's anything you haven't had a chance to share that is sort of top of your list as we move to close. So, Nicole, any last thoughts that you want to hit on?
I think, in terms of breaking into industry roles from academic settings, because I have a lot of empathy for how difficult that might feel right now. There are different organizations you can access also. There's DIME, Society for Digital Mental Health, SBM. These are great settings where I meet a lot of people who have aligned values. And, you can cultivate your peer networks also. But basically, when I think about how to break in, it's about being easy to partner with, making sure you're available. I often say I do consulting, but I often say I would do this not for the money. And I just have preliminary conversations with people until they offer it. Then they say like, oh, well, I'd like to bring you on retainer, or, I'd like to use you as a consultant at a fixed rate or something like that. But it's really the relationships that I'm building first. Those relationships become fruitful and turn into something else because people trust your integrity, your values, your ability to speak to the problem. So I would say that's really important first.
No, that's great. Robin.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was thinking of an adjacent comment, but I just have to 100% that. I can probably almost every role but one that I've had has been based on a relationship. And so what does that mean? It means in every role, show up as yourself, show up with your curiosity, your excitement. Um, so that because people are seeing you even if you don't know they're looking at you, right? Because they bring again they will invite you to do something and you're thinking. I had a recent example of some of my consulting work. Someone called from a couple of jobs ago and thinking, oh, okay, and it's something that I'm going to say it again. Please be open to trying new things, because you just never know how the application of your skills can be used for you to make a difference and have impact on people's lives. And that openness has taken me far and also helped me, especially if you're early in your career, figuring out where's the best place to position yourself to make a difference, because there are a lot of places you can. And also at a very practical level where, we know the environment we're in right now, it may just be practical to jump in, assuming your values are aligned and try and see where it takes you. This is coming from someone with a pretty serendipitous career pathway, but really, I heard this in Nicole underline, have fun. That fun, it sounds silly, but just enjoy the journey. And I say that with all sincerity. Um, Enjoy learning as you
I
go.
feel like that's the perfect point to end on a Friday afternoon. I have loved what you do here. We've got a theme of joy and having some fun. And I'm sure everyone can join me here in a huge thank you, Nicole and Robin, for this really, really thoughtful conversation. I learned a lot, appreciated the chance to contribute and to learn. Uh, and yeah, look forward to talking further. And for those who are watching, I'm sure you'll get some follow-up as people have additional questions and thoughts as everyone carries forward in this work. So thank you so much and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the opportunity.
Yes, same. Thank you.